Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Welcome back to CyCon. I trust you've had a good time to relax, to network, and you're ready to push on with what we have planned for you this afternoon. So this session is titled Cyber Deterrence in NATO. And deterrence has indeed been one of the buzzwords of the conference today. We've discussed it from the strategic perspective, we discussed it from the very practical IoT perspective, and many other angles. So I trust that the fans of deterrence issues are very happy with the conference so far and ready to push on. Before I get to our panel, I'll briefly introduce why we're discussing this issue here. And the reason is really that NATO is celebrating its 70th anniversary, but the moment when deterrence could have been considered to become one of the alliance topics can be dated back 5 years, when NATO at its Wales summit agreed that the principles of one for all and all for one apply in cyberspace. And the past 5 years, we've also seen that the cyber attacks are there, they're getting worse, they're targeting us in increasingly diverse perspectives, angles, but what we haven't seen is really anyone going at large at NATO as such. So it might be a good moment to ask, really, is cyber deterrence working or not? Earlier today, we've seen the Estonian president announce the 5 principles that Estonia now adheres to when it comes to states' behavior in cyberspace. And we've also learned how the military approach to that in the different countries has been. But now to our distinguished panel. And as moderator, I am in a very comfortable position that I really don't need to introduce any of the speakers, because who you see on stage are really distinguished experts in their area. But I will do that anyway. On my immediate left is Dr. Antonio Missiroli. He's the Assistant Secretary General of NATO, including for cyber. Well, Dr. Missiroli is a well-known name before he entered NATO as the ASG. He has written extensively on European security, he has worked with the European Commission, he has had an academic career, a career in journalism, he holds a PhD in history. So welcome, sir, to CyCon. Our next speaker is Jason Healey from Columbia University. Again, I wouldn't be able to count all his career here. Let's just say that he's one of the leading analysts there is, in my humble opinion. And also, he was speaking about attribution long before anyone else did, just as to advertise. And to his left is Professor Duncan Hollis from Temple University Law School in Philadelphia. Again, Professor Hollis doesn't really need a long introduction. One of the things that he's currently working with is with the Organization of American States, where his primary task and responsibility is to really enhance the transparency when it comes to cyber operations and the role of states therein. And as an administrative remark, we will follow the more or less classical approach to a panel discussion. For starters, we will have opening statements, presentations from all the speakers, and the later part of the panel, we will entertain questions from the audience. So please pay attention, think along, and be ready with some creative questions in the later part of this session. And to really get us going quickly, I will give first the floor to Dr. Missiroli. Antonio, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be back at CyCon. It is actually my second CAP I have to say that the weather last year was better. And I would like to congratulate the CCDCOE for this event. It's a great success. To some extent, CyCon is becoming a victim of its own success due to the large numbers of participants. Let me start by saying that deterrence, in general, is a core element of NATO's overall strategy to provide for the collective defense of the allies. And over the past 5 years, in fact, NATO has taken its most significant steps since the end of the Cold War to strengthen its deterrence posture. NATO is now able to respond to a crisis more rapidly than ever. It has focused efforts on conventional forces, forward presence, including in this country, joint air power and maritime forces, as well as countering what we call hybrid threats and improving cyber defenses. But when thinking about cyber deterrence in particular, which I understand as malicious activity in cyberspace, deterring malicious activity in cyberspace, I would like to mention 2 important points to bear in mind before discussing exactly what actions NATO is taking. First, we must determine clearly who and what we want to deter. No international organization or nation, for that matter, is arguably able to deter all bad behavior. And not all bad behavior is a matter of national or international security. Instead, we must consider what actions we find truly unacceptable and focus our efforts there. Second, we should try not to fall into a cyber versus cyber mindset. Deterring malicious cyber activities certainly does require actions in cyberspace. But one of the strengths of NATO, and by NATO I mean both the alliance and the individual allies, is their range of capabilities, especially when considering attacks that might rise to the threshold of an armed attack. The concept of cross-domain deterrence is an important one to bear in mind, rather than intra-domain or in-kind response or retaliation only. So what is NATO doing to make the potential cost of a cyber attack too high and make the potential gains of such an attack low or as low as possible? At the Brussels summit last year, allies expressed their determination to employ the full range of capabilities, I'm quoting, including cyber, to deter, defend against, and counter the full spectrum of cyber threats, including those conducted as part of a hybrid campaign. They also resolved, and I quote again, to continue to work together to develop measures which would enable us to impose costs on those who harm us. In February 2019, a few months ago, allies took an important step in order to systematize and strengthen their ability to address significant malicious cyber activities by agreeing on a guide for strategic options to respond to those activities. These response options will help NATO and the allies to enhance their situational awareness about what is happening in cyberspace, to boost their resilience, and to work together with partners. We must use all the tools at our disposal, political, diplomatic, military, to be able to tackle the cyber threats that we face. We must also recognize that the level of malicious cyber activity below the threshold of armed conflict will remain a continuous challenge. We must make it harder for our adversaries to inflict damage in cyberspace, and we also must consider how to impose a price on malicious cyber activity, a price sufficient to deter states doing that. Hostile actors must be presented with strategic dilemmas and know that they run a credible risk of response. Ultimately, if we do not define through our action the behaviors that we will not accept, we may end up tacitly accepting all behaviors through our inaction, and thus perhaps even contribute to the continuing escalation of malicious activity. I would emphasize, though, that whatever the response, NATO will continue to act in accordance with international law, recognizing that we all stand to benefit from a norms-based, predictable, and secure cyberspace. These efforts to respond to malicious activity, however, must be built upon a strong foundation, and this foundation is security and resilience. This is what deterrence by denial means in this domain and for NATO. And this means for the alliance protecting our own networks and securing our mission. Cyber is now a domain of operations alongside land, sea, and air, as Admiral Nilsson explained this morning. And the Cyberspace Operations Center is being set up at our military headquarters in Mons. I would say that it's currently closer to 60 than 1,000. But allies too need to be more resilient, as we are only as strong individually and collectively as our weakest link. And one of our key tools for enhancing our cyber defense and resilience is the Cyber Defense Pledge. Adopted in 2016 at the Warsaw Summit, allies pledged to strengthen and enhance the cyber defenses of their national networks and infrastructures as a matter of priority. We have concluded 2 rounds of self-assessment and reporting, with the most recent report going to heads of state and government at the Brussels Summit last year. And we are nearly at the end of the 3rd cycle of the pledge right now. Just last week, in fact, I had the pleasure to take part in the Cyber Defense Pledge conference hosted by the United Kingdom in London. What I can tell you is that since 2016, almost every ally has upgraded cyber defenses. We have also seen the political impact of the pledge in several ways. The pledge has attracted high-level political attention in allied nations, helping to continue to elevate cyber defense from a technical to a strategic issue. It has also been useful in bringing together a variety of domestic national stakeholders, encouraging and fostering a whole-of-government approach and whole-of-society approach to cyber defense. And it has served as an important platform for allies to share best practice. Last, but certainly not least, it has helped increasing resources for cyber defense, both human, financial, and technical resources. And that is something that was not a foregone conclusion. It also indicates that political attention is now focused on that. And if I may allow a side remark, of course, it has proved that it has been easier, in particular for European allies, to increase cyber defense spending than defense spending proper. Throughout NATO, in fact, allies are working together, pooling their knowledge and experience, helping each other, and with a tangible multiplier effect across the alliance. And this proves further the point that cyber defense is a team sport. This morning you were presented with a metaphor from basketball. Being Italian and European will make one to football. And of course, as you probably know, the unofficial anthem of the Liverpool Football Club, if I may paraphrase it, allies now know that they will never walk alone. So finally, to conclude my introductory remarks, I would like to mention the European Union. Indeed, once again, cyber defense cannot be accomplished alone, and our work with the EU provides us with an important partner for cyber defense issues. In addition to our ongoing work under the framework of the NATO-EU Joint Declaration and the technical arrangement between the CERTs of the 2 organizations, I would perhaps mention in particular the EU's recently agreed sanctions regime in response to cyber attack, and the President mentioned that in her introductory speech this morning. Just a few weeks ago, the Council established a framework that allows the EU to impose targeted restrictive measures to deter and respond to cyber attacks which constitute an external threat to the EU and its member states. These are smart sanctions, quintessentially smart sanctions, and they include assets freezes and travel bans. And this is something that could also help us doing precisely the kind of deterrence work that we intend to do. This sort of economic also response is complementary and reinforcing to the actions that NATO is able to take in response to malicious cyber activity. I discussed earlier on about imposing costs on attacks, and it is precisely actions like these, particularly when supported by the political and military tools at the disposal of NATO, that can perhaps begin to change the behavior of those who would do us harm. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. It's perhaps a provocative question, but if I may pick up on where you mentioned the EU, the sanctions regime, and earlier also deterrence by denial. Now, in one of the earlier panels, it was mentioned that deterrence by denial, essentially, we can build a higher wall, but there will always be someone who will build an even longer ladder to climb this wall. If you take a look at both EU's and NATO's posture, in 2017, the EU came up with this so-called cyber package. And to my ears, it was, or to my eyes, it was rephrased or worded as using NATO's lingo: deterrence, resilience, defense. So EU seemed to pick up quite a lot of this NATO native talk. So what's your assessment now that the EU has put on something tangible on the table? If you attack us, there could be sanctions. Would NATO be ready to follow suit on anything similar?
The main difference between NATO and the EU is that NATO is not a norms-setting organization. It is a security and military alliance, and therefore it doesn't have the powers. It is not part of its remit to generate sanctions of that kind. It is not within the portfolio of the alliance. Of course, there are certain forms of restrictive measures that the NATO can apply. They can only be applied and implemented through the allies and not by the alliance as such, apart from some minor diplomatic measures such as the expulsion of diplomats, which is something that happened, you may remember, a few months ago following the Skripal affair. But normally it is through the allies that these measures are implemented. Of course, there is a general deterrence and defense posture by the alliance that is also meant to serve this purpose. And I would like to add that although deterrence by partnership is not high on the agenda of the alliance, of course there are other instruments also in the cyber domain that the alliance could put to use. And one of them is the fact that 9 allies had put at the disposal of SHAPE of a Supreme Allied Commander their what we call sovereign cyber effects that could be used also for active cyber operations in this field in order to protect the mission of the alliance, in particular its missions and operations as they are. So this is part of a broader set of capabilities that are at the disposal of the alliance. But yet again, the emphasis is on the defensive mission of the alliance and also on the fact that we keep a cross-domain approach, a full spectrum set of instruments to use in order perhaps also to inflict costs on those who do us harm.
Great. Thank you very much. Speaking of individual allies, I think it's a good time to move on to Jason Healey. A word of advertisement. He has also written an article which you can find in the CyCon book. But before you do that, here's Jason live on stage with the highlights.
Thank you. Live on stage and holding a laser. So I do have laser pointer dominance, so thank you for your attention. Don't make me use it. So I wanted to look at deterrence, but also not just deterrence, because the new strategy and vision of persistent engagement is really where a lot of the conversation is in Washington, D.C. right now. I know it came up this morning. And the two concepts are really tied, and I thought it would be useful to talk through them and then maybe in the Q&A get into how they might apply to NATO. And you better hope that I press the next button and not slip and press the laser button. So it really has been, the persistent engagement is absolutely the biggest shift that I've seen. With my co-editor, Carl Grindel, that's here, we wrote a history book on cyber conflict. And I have to say, this is the most significant thing that we have seen since the very earliest days of 1998. And what the vision is predicated on, of saying the way we normally think about war and peace, it's episodic, right? You have times of war, you have times of peace, you have a ramp up to it and down afterwards, isn't what we face here. Or not only. We have constant contact between the adversaries. So our ways of thinking that are based on these episodes between adversaries won't be fully accurate. And so it's been rooted in 20 years of conversation on active defense and deterrence. And I think it melds the two together. I won't talk more about the active defense aspect of it because it's not relevant to this panel. I did want to point on deterrence that reality has moved well past the theoretical discussion. Right? If you're in a conversation that says cyber deterrence doesn't happen or it's impossible, that is just not accurate anymore. Reality has moved on. Let me defend that statement by first saying nations for 20, the US has been talking about a digital Pearl Harbor since 1991. So of the 28 years, of the 78 years since the actual Pearl Harbor, we've been worried about this large-scale attack. And yet, we still have not had large-scale attacks that have caused death and destruction, especially intentionally. And so you're seeing restraint by states to not cross that line into death and destruction. If we were talking about any other kind of conflict, we'd be calling that deterrence. Or at least we'd be looking at deterrence as part of that explanation. And yet in our field, we look at where it's failing and what it's not stopping and declare that it's impossible or that it's not working. Also, I want to call out here the US experience in the election interference of 2016. Several of the participants that were in the Situation Room discussing how the US should respond, General Clapper said that the US took options off the table because the United States was worried about the Russian presence in the US electrical grid. Then one of Obama's personal aides, a guy named Ben Rhodes, who's very powerful in the White House, said that the US took options off the table in responding to the Russians because we were worried about an escalation path that will lead to the Russians actually changing the vote count or attacking the election more directly. Talking about changing one adversary's decision calculus because of capabilities or future operations, again, that's what we call deterrence. It's just that it happened against the US. Right? So we need to start getting ourselves out of the theory and looking at the actual practical reality that we're seeing. And I'll point out that the military sees deterrence and persistent engagement as quite separate, although complementary. Deterrence is useful for some areas, but it's not particularly useful in this DoD view in this area of constant contact, of persistent engagement. That's not standard within the United States government, and in fact, John Bolton has done quite the opposite of saying we're authorizing offensive cyber operations to create these frameworks of deterrence, and even saying that OPM is the kind of threat to privacy that we specifically are determined to deter. And I think I'm the only one that can actually put up this slide and get away with it. Mustache jokes. And so what the DoD and the academic, and what's really striking out of it is that this persistent engagement was rooted in political science and international relations theory. Every one of the parents of the document was an international relations PhD. And so it's really quite fascinating. Imagine that in the nuclear days, if the folks that were writing the strategy that Curtis LeMay or one of the other folks used had been written by the IR theorists. Right? Instead, you had this huge difference between what IR thought deterrence was going to be and what Curtis LeMay wanted to fight. So I'm sorry about the small print here. I'll walk through it. Because what DoD hasn't done yet is say, well, what's the causation of what they want to do? So we've tried to do that in this slide, of one, laying out the problem, of the Department of Defense saying adversaries are acting without restraint to destabilize the US, erode national sources of power. So that's the problem statement. The result that of the US policy is a stable environment and continued superiority. And I think this is an interesting thing to ask when someone is talking to you that they want deterrence, is do you want deterrence because you want a stable environment, or do you want deterrence because you want superiority? Because you might not be able to get both. And right now, US policy is to achieve both. Now the method, 2 through 9, is saying that the US has to defend forward against these threats, that it must do so with reduced operational constraints, that with this persistent presence in foreign systems, that's yours, that we will be able to intercept and halt cyber threats, enter their networks, and learn what they're doing. That will therefore, we're on step 5 now, improve US defenses, because we will learn their capabilities, we will have their tactic, techniques, procedures, we will have advanced warning of their intentions of their attacks, and therefore improve US defenses, improving the resilience, the deterrence by denial. That got brought up. Also, it can impose friction. If the US is disrupting their command and control infrastructure, if we are patching our systems from their vulnerabilities before we can use them, if we are halting their operations, General Nakasoni's word, we're imposing friction. We're not deterring them, but it is imposing costs, making it harder for them to do what they want, or at least DoD doesn't see that as deterrent. They see it as friction. It's more like war fighting, interdiction, if you will. Also, through this friction, adversaries will have less capability. They're going to be spending more of their own time on defense, having to defend their networks and rebuild this disrupted infrastructure. Therefore, they will have reduced capability to continue to attack the United States and its allies. Also, some of the DoD hasn't said this as much as some of the theorists writing, that say, and therefore this will lead to a process of tacit bargaining. So that we don't decide what the norms are at some table in Geneva or in New York, that we are deciding it by fighting day in, day out in the networks. And by getting in there and throwing elbows, we will help decide what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And that reminds me of your comments of the impose a price, defining through actions, not inaction. And that's really what they're trying to get at here, is this element of tacit bargaining. Also, now 9 is where the US comes in with a specific deterrent statement. In addition to all of this getting in and throwing elbows, we want to use offensive cyber capabilities, operational prep in the environment, to get in adversary systems to impose a threat. So that way, if if Vladimir Putin might want to do something to the US electrical grid, well, we are holding his electrical grid or something else of that he values equivalently. And therefore, these steps 2 through 9 leads to the result of 10. And so it's a brilliant, again, it's an absolutely fascinating strategy, but we have no idea if it's actually going to work that way, right? It's an experiment, and we have to treat it like an experiment because it's based on a lot of assumptions that we just don't fully understand yet. So I think it's absolutely brilliant. I support it, but there's a lot to worry about. So is it likely to work that way? Let me just talk about control theory. I'm going to get academic-y. So in control theory, what they're basically saying is that this is going to apply negative feedback. That's the feedback that we're going to give is countering the initial stimulus. It's like a thermostat, right? If it gets too hot, it makes it cooler. If it gets too cool, it makes it hotter. That's negative feedback. There's also a positive feedback, and we understand that, right? Where a little bit of feedback amplifies the initial signal. Driving on ice is like that, right? You might give a small input to the wheel and might give a wildly erratic output compared to what you had put in. So what we've done in research at Columbia University is say, all right, well, what's the full set of feedback loops that we're looking at here? Not only the ones that DoD talked about. So we have something that we call on-net. This is the more immediate collision, results of the collision between the adversaries. And this is in the handout that many of you got beforehand, those that got here early. So we said some of the on-net friction, the on-net feedback includes friction and tacit bargaining that DoD talked about, right? If you're hitting the other, or if you're causing friction on the other side, especially if capabilities are expensive or hard to rebuild, then that's going to impose negative feedback. If capabilities are inexpensive and easy to replace, then friction's not going to give that much negative feedback. Because sure, you took down our capabilities, but we're able to bring them right back. Tit for tat, it works a little bit the other way, or at least this is my assessment. If there is a tit for tat dynamic, then if something is done unto you, then you want to do back unto them. And one of our colleagues, Stuart Baker in the United States, said, we should be proportional plus a little bit. You know, give them a little bit extra, right? And that's talking about these tit-for-tat dynamics. We also have off-net feedback loops, which are happening, less in the heat of the fight, but later on. I include deterrence here. The quote there is from one of the parents of this document, Dr. Emily Goldman. There's also feedback loops of perceived restraint and adherence to norms. You can call this broken windows theory of policing, right? If everyone else is following the norms and you're most of the norms most of the time, there's a lot of pressure on you to do so. If you feel that everyone else is ignoring the norms, then you feel less pressure to. Right now in the US, the sense is that the US is the only one following the norms. There's emotion, cognitive biases. Deterrence wants to cause fear, but what if you cause anger? What if you cause a perceived status challenge? And also posture and organizational dynamics. If creating an offensive posture, offense is the best defense, might cause others to do the same. Creating a cyber command might cause others to do the same. If an organization has offensive responsibilities, it's going to want to conduct offensive operations. That's how it gets budget. That's how you get medals. That's how you get responsibility. If every adversary is doing that, then that's going to lead to this positive feedback. So the key question is, well, what do we think? Is cyber conflict and competition likely to be more sensitive to the positive feedback that makes things worse, or the negative feedback that's making things better? Can we get both stability and superiority? So I won't get into it here, but because of reasons of a separate IR theory called security dilemma, I think there's a lot of evidence that it's more like driving a really bad car with really old tires on really icy roads, and that it lends itself to the negative feedback. But that's my assessment without a ton of evidence. And so or without fully laid out evidence. So how are we going to know it's working? And this is the paper that's in the IEEE book that you got, where my co-author Neil Jenkins and I, we do think there are some reasonable ways that we can measure this. Not just we're shooting and they're keeping their heads down, the very military metric, but I think the metrics that are very much in line with what the policymakers are going to want. What I really want is to make sure that we know we can distinguish success from failure. So that way, in 5 years, if it looks like if things haven't gotten radically better, we don't have an Afghan situation where the generals just come in front of the president and say, "Sir, we can win this thing. Just give us we just got to defend forward, a little more forward, and we can win this." That we can be sure that we know. And I won't get onto I think I've taken enough time, so I won't go on from there. Thank you very much, and I will pass the laser. You have slides, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Jason. A quick question. Maybe a case study, but in any case, interesting thing to witness is the relationship between the US and China in cyber. So, for instance, a few years prior, there was an agreement between President Obama and President Xi on the mutual refrainment on attacks for stealing intellectual property, or however it was worded. So do you think statements or agreements on the top level that let's agree not to do harm, would these be a tool for for deterrence to assure that deterrence in cyber could work?
Yeah, I wouldn't. Yes, but I wouldn't agree to the word deterrence in that. Again, I think we tend to use deterrence as a catch-all word for anything meaning restraint or stability on the other side. And so absolutely, I mean, most, although certainly not all observers, saw a drastic decrease in Chinese operations for a period after that no longer seems to be holding. And so we had an agreement, and it seemed to have led to the right result. It didn't lead to zero. But diplomacy rarely is about getting to zero. It's usually about better. Yeah. And so things were better. And if they stopped being better, then I think we can say, well, what led to that, and how can we get there? And in the article that's in the book that you all got, there's quite a bit more on that case study.
Okay. Thank you very much. And now let's move along to Professor Hollis. Duncan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me begin by thanking Siim and the organizers. It's a real pleasure to be back at CyCon. Given that all of three panelists have a background in academia, I thought I'd begin with a famous joke about academics. An engineer, a physicist, and an economist are stranded on a desert island with a single can of food. And our engineer cleverly uses a stick as a lever and a rock as a fulcrum, and works, and nothing. Can't get the can open. Our physicist does some math, drops the can from a set height at a certain angle, nothing. Can stays closed. Our economist steps up and says, I have the solution. We should assume a can opener. And I tell the joke because I think the same joke applies to international lawyers and deterrence. Most international lawyers assume deterrence. We assume states are deterred from doing whatever the law says states shouldn't do. And, just as importantly, we assume that the only thing that really matters is deterrence emphasizing that states not violate the law. I think the rising emphasis on cyber deterrence opens both of these assumptions to challenge. So, for example, recent research by Shaney, Afrani, and others suggests that states may not be shaping their behavior to international law, at least not in the law form that we've seen worked on here for years in the form of the Tallinn manuals. And at the same time, I think it's, conversations about cyber deterrence are taking place in political and military terms and not legal ones. Now, in questioning these assumptions that international law and international lawyers make about deterrence, I don't want to be seen as suggesting that international law is irrelevant to the conversation. Far from it. I actually think that international law is very relevant to deterrence in at least two possible respects. One is that international law could facilitate deterrence, right? That we could have international law permit effective defensive measures for deterrence by denial, or permit or even require certain responsive measures to effectuate deterrence by punishment. On the other hand, international law may constrain deterrent activity, right? Prohibiting certain defensive measures or offensive modalities that states might otherwise want to take. Now, the rationale for doing so might either be, oh, we don't actually want to deter this thing, or it may be that the activity designed to achieve deterrence represents some sort of cure worse than the disease. So what I wanted to do in my brief remarks to start things off is explore the relationship between international law and deterrence in three respects. First, I want to explore a little bit what international law has to say about the objects of deterrence, the things we want to deter. Then I want to examine how international law regulates the defensive and responsive measures we might use to engage in a deterrence strategy. And third, I'll propose a little bit more of a critical take on the legal status quo, right? Asking if we have the right regulatory balance between constraining deterrence in some respects and facilitating it in others. And I'll be honest, at the outset, my conclusion's a modest one. Unlike in other areas, I'm not ready to say that deterrence requires new international law. But I do believe we need a research agenda to bring international law into the conversation as part of our analysis of deterrence strategies. All right, so to begin my analysis, let's reverse the usual international lawyers approach, which simply says, oh, what's the law? And then we just expect deterrence to follow. Let's ask, what's the behavior do we want deterred? And then let's say, well, what does international law tell us about that behavior in some way? And if we think along these lines, I would group the possible behaviors that we want to deter into at least 5 categories, right? 5 labels we might attach to deterrent behavior that are of legal significance. So 1, armed attacks. These are at the top of the spectrum. The most grave uses of force. This is the object of longstanding focus of NATO policies, even indeed its existence, right? Then we have uses of force, right, which are lesser deployments of armed force, but with violent consequences. We have what international lawyers call internationally wrongful acts. And this is the term of art for violations of international law, be it of treaties or be it of customary international law, like the duty of non-intervention or, more controversially, this idea of sovereignty. Then we kind of move beyond the law, although I think law is still relevant here, and we could say, oh, well, we have violations of non-legally binding norms. Think here the 2015 GGE consensus report. And finally, I would say there are these what we might call other unwanted acts, right? These are acts that are lawful, but yet for some reason we still might want to deter them. And we might want to deter them because they are regarded as unfriendly in some way, like cutting off market access to your ICT products, blocking web traffic. I put up here this idea of one-sided deterrence, which I think is what we would say about espionage, right? We want to deter others from conducting espionage against us, but we want to retain the right to engage in that activity. And how do we navigate that? And then there's actually what I'd call idiosyncratic preferences, where we might want to deter behavior, or a state might want to deter behavior that other states not only like but prefer. So some states might want to deter acts of freedom of expression online because they see it as inconsistent with their interests and values. The categories are not necessarily exclusive, so most states view armed attacks as uses of force. It's just it's a higher threshold. And more importantly, for our purposes, I think that they are riddled with ambiguities and conflicts. So let me flag 4 that I think are worthy of your attention. The first here, I have a small picture of Jean-Paul Sartre, and he stands in for what I'd call the existential problems with the law, right? And that's the idea that some states dispute the existence of one of those categories I just laid out. So, for example, the United States government does not see use of force as its own category and conflates it with armed attacks. There's just a single category there rather than 2. Other problems are what I'd call interpretive, right? Like debates over what cyber attacks qualify as a violation of Article 2.4, which we have been debating since the first CyCon, and I will say no more on here, since I'm sure we've all heard plenty of that over the years. I think there's the thorny question of technical and legal attribution, right? That because some of those categories I just listed are dependent on state behavior or behavior for which a state can be held responsible. And so some of this only works if we know not just what we're deterring, but as the Assistant Secretary said, who we're trying to deter. And on top of all of this, I think there's an application problem here. We've had limited public statements by states about what they think international law means in cyberspace, this morning maybe being a notable exception. And more pertinently, when it comes to looking at unwanted cyber activity, with the sole, perhaps I think the sole exception of the United Kingdom, we've seen a real reluctance of states to say that behavior violates international law. And no one, to my mind, has actually said what international law they think is violated. Now, why should you care? Right? Why should you care about these categories, let alone the deep legal debates that they've engendered? And I think we should care because from a legal perspective, the consequences states are legally required, permitted, or prohibited from pursuing are dictated by what category we put our deterrence object into, right? So there's like a menu of behavioral options for effectuating deterrence that are key to these categories. And the menu is longer or shorter depending on what category of behavior you place your object of deterrence in, and whether you're pursuing deterrence by denial or deterrence by punishment. So like our menu for deterrence by denial is pretty short. On the one hand, some, but not all states say there's an international obligation of due diligence, right, requiring states whose territories host malicious cyber activity to take feasible measures to terminate them. The 2015 UNGEGE report has a duty to assist that is not legally binding, but even though it's voluntary, if followed, the norm could raise attackers' costs as part of a deterrence by denial strategy. When it comes to deterrence by punishment, I think international's menu is a bit longer. It's got 5 potential consequences. Self-defense. Under the UN Charter and custom, right, states enjoy a right of self-defense when they suffer an armed attack. That right can be exercised collectively, and some states would say it can also be exercised anticipatorily, right, in advance. Then we have this idea of forceful countermeasures. That is, something that is a use of force, but not an armed attack. If you suffer that, Judge Bruno Sima, a judge on the World Court, famously stated in the Oil Platform's opinion, maybe you're entitled to proportionately respond with a use of force of your own that also doesn't cross the armed attack threshold, although I would note there's a categorical existential problem in that category is not universally accepted. Then there is a subject many of us have discussed here in the past, that's countermeasures, right? That this unlawful activities, the performance of which is excused because of some prior illegality, right? That countermeasures are what states impose costs that they would otherwise not be able to impose absent some prior violation of international law. I think it's important also not to forget there are treaty-based responses, whether it's the UN Charter or the WTO. Certain treaties say, hey, if this treaty provision is breached, the treaty itself provides a remedial set of costs that might be brought to bear. And then finally, there's this kind of all-encompassing category that we call retorsion. And retorsion are lawful but unfriendly acts that you engage in to either deny your adversary something or impose costs so they stop doing something you don't like them doing. And that's often been expelling diplomats or withdrawing financial assistance. In cyberspace, it might be blocking websites or making public accusations of responsibility for some cyber operation. Now, the availability of each of these operations or each of these options turns on which deterrence category is implicated, right? So self-defense is only available in an armed attack, right? That's the only one, you got to be in the armed attack to be able to use self-defense as a responsive option. Countermeasures, you can use them when you got an armed attack, a use of force, or an internationally wrongful act. And acts of retorsion, because they're lawful to begin with, you can use them anytime you want. Indeed, you don't even have to have an act you're responding to use them. And so I think by tying states' deterrence strategies to international law's categories of behavior, the law creates both opportunities and obstacles for deterrence, right? So in some cases, the existing rules facilitate deterrence, right? They give, look, with respect to armed attacks, international law gives states a lot of rooms to maneuver, a lot of things on the menu to choose from to calibrate deterrence, either by denial or in this case by punishment. On the other hand, the range of options in other cases is much more limited, where the underlying conduct is, say, like the OPM hack is lawful, right? You're limited in your ability to respond to, basically retorsion, as it were. And I should emphasize that international law's regulation of deterrence is not limited to just this association of category of behavior we want to deter response options. International law also regulates the response options themselves. So, for example, even if self-defense is legally available, you must conduct your self-defense in a certain way. For example, you must be proportional in your use of self-defense. The one I want to flag, just because the list is so long, is countermeasures, right? Because they have an initial appeal, and I think that we've studied them here at CyCon because of their appeal. Oh, any violation of international law, I can use countermeasures. International law actually kind of hits you at the back end on countermeasures by imposing a whole set of conditions that actually make them really hard to apply in practice. So they've got to be proportional. They have to respond to a prior unlawful act. So unlike anticipatory self-defense, there's arguably no anticipatory countermeasures. They have to be reversible. The point of countermeasures is not actually, they weren't designed for deterrence, they were designed for compliance. And so once the state returns to a state of compliance, you're supposed to be able to remove any effects and go back to the status quo ante, as it were. They're not supposed to cause third-party harms. And in an environment where we're operating on privately owned ICT platforms or third-state networks, that's a real problem. And particularly since the UN International Law Commission emphasized that among the things you're supposed to respect in doing countermeasures is fundamental human rights, that also cabins this deterrent option here. And two more I think really worth noting as we think about countermeasures is one, you're supposed to tell the state you're targeting that they did the wrong act and you're doing these things that you're doing to them for purposes of a countermeasure. The only exception is if it's an urgent countermeasure, like say, you don't tell the state that you're going to freeze their bank accounts in advance because they'd take all the money out of the bank account. So there's an exception if the countermeasure is going to be urgent. And the question that we international lawyers have been wrestling with is, does that exception swallow the rule, or how do we navigate this? And finally, the one that I understand, I wasn't here for this morning's talk, is the question of, certainly the victim is able to engage in countermeasures, but unlike self-defense, there's a much larger open question about collective countermeasures. Whether states can band together and engage in countermeasures collectively. I understand that Estonia is now putting itself on the side of the law, international law does or should allow this, and that actually ironically stands in contrast to the leanings of some in the Tallinn Manual International Group of Experts and others who regularly attend these sorts of events. All of this, again, assumes that international law's response measures are widely shared and clear, but the same existential, interpretive, and application problems I said about the categories of cyber behavior also apply to these response measures. So famously, reports suggest that the UNGGE in 2016 and 17, it was China that refused to acknowledge a category of self-defense and countermeasures with respect to cyberspace. The US has questioned whether countermeasures must respect fundamental human rights. So kind of in sum, I think despite the under-theorization of assumption or under-theorized assumptions of most international lawyers, international law has a lot to say about what states may want to deter and the different vehicles they may use to do so. And I think if developed and deployed carefully, acts like retorsion and countermeasures could be effective in constituting the relevant rules of the road and impact reducing, right? Reducing the impact of unwanted activity. At the same time, the ambiguities and disputes that I've mentioned could constrain deterrent capacities, right? And that might be bad, where there's a consensus that we all agree we really want to deter X, but the law is in some ways holding us back. Could be good, where, again, we think that there are other values like human rights that should be served that may take priority over our deterrent activities, or reduce the risk of escalation, the things that Jay talked about, the worry that what we'll get out of this deterrent response is a tit for tat and a worse situation. All of which takes me to my final inquiry, which is the international legal status quo, is it a sufficient or appropriate constraining and facilitating measurement of deterrent capacities? Is international law working here in a way that we like? And some, I think, might be inclined to say, yeah. Jay said, no digital Pearl Harbors. Cyber threats are bad and spreading, but the costs are largely in economic terms. We don't have that wide-scale examples of lethality and the like. And maybe the inability of states to come to consensus on how the law applies suggests maybe we work more on that than trying to already move to changing the law. On the other hand, I think there might be reasonable grounds to say, well, we might want to adjust the law to accommodate the realities of deterrence and the need to make it effective in cyberspace. So it seems worthwhile to me to take up the Estonian suggestion and think hard about whether collective countermeasures should be clarified as within the bounds of international law. It's curious that the EU cyber sanctions, they're laid out, but there's no legal justification. So I don't know whether those cyber sanctions are perceived by the EU adopters as acts of retorsion or acts of countermeasures, and there could be actually some value in articulating, oh, this is or isn't an example of a collective countermeasure mechanism. And I should be clear, I don't necessarily think saying the law itself is insufficient is always going to be pro-deterrence, right? We might want to work on that notification regime. If you're thinking from a third party or an ICT company perspective, you might really want to be notified when your networks or your technology is the subject or the playing field on which countermeasures, for example, are being effectuated. And to take up, I think, Jay's last suggestion, there is a third way, and all international lawyers, when asked the question, love this answer, right? It depends, right? We might conclude we don't know, right? We don't have the data to tell us about the role international law plays when it comes to deterrence, right? We might want more empirical evidence. And I'd note, kind of in closing, despite my opening criticism about international law's assumptions for deterrence, it is worth asking what deterrent value there is in accusing another state of violating international law in their cyber operations, right? Do accusations have more power when they come with the weight of international law behind them, a suggestion that you're violating the UN Charter, or you're violating this treaty, or this rule, this duty of non-intervention, as opposed to what we've seen to date, which is we know it was you and it was wrong, or it's unacceptable, without trying to bring law in. And it would be interesting to think about, are there ways to study what international law work could do here in a way that might actually facilitate deterrence in some way. So for now, I think international lawyers need to stop making assumptions about deterrence. We can and should do more to engage outside the legal realm with the important military and political strategic questions. I'm clear-eyed. International law is not a salve for all wounds, but I also don't believe it's irrelevant to these conversations. And it's my hope that some of you may agree, and with enough time and effort, maybe we can figure out a little bit more about how can the rule of law effectuate cyber deterrence? How can it help these strategies? At the same time, how can cyber deterrence comport with the rule of law that is so fundamental to the modern international community of states? With that, I'll stop and look forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you very much, Duncan. A quick question to you before we move on to the questions phase. As I mentioned, you are an expert working with the Organization of American States, and I would say it's a global phenomenon that there is no globally shared consensus when it comes to international law regarding cyberspace. Given this is a transatlantic conference and a transatlantic forum for discussions, what's your assessment? Is there any kind of consensus perhaps emerging in the Western Hemisphere, if you could generalize?
Sure, I've already used "it depends" once, so I'm reluctant to use it again. But when I'm not a professor, among other things I do is I'm on this thing called the OAS Juridical Committee. Those of you who know the UN International Law Commission, this is the regional equivalent in the OAS. And one of the things that we've done, looking ahead to the UN group of government experts, is we've had a lot of forward progress over the years about international law applies in cyberspace, and we're now at the question of how does it apply. And the UN group of government experts will be taking up that question. But it occurred to us in the OAS that we don't necessarily have to wait for the GGE to get there. A first step is not to necessarily come out with any broad statements about what the law says, but to get more transparency from states as to what they think the rules are so that we can answer your question, which is where do we have consensus and where do we have divergence? So one of the things the juridical committee has done is we put out a formal questionnaire to the 34 member states and said, here are a series of questions where, if and it's voluntary, nobody's required to answer, but if you'd like to tell us, do you think sovereignty is a rule or do you think it's a principle? This would be an opportunity to do so. And the OAS is not planning a Tallinn-like regional thought. This is just to collect the views of states to communicate and to feed into broader, whether it's transatlantic or global processes. I don't pretend that it's going to make a tremendous contribution, but I think it would make a contribution the more states are able, as they become informed, to express not just their strategies in cyberspace, but how they understand, what their lawyers are telling them behind the scene, how they understand both the way law is helping them and the law is constraining them. The more we know that, the more we can map areas where we need to work.
Great. Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, we're well on time, so please prepare your questions. And to start off with the Q&A session, I will first have a question to all the panelists, or actually I have three questions to three panelists. And the questions are the following. So in your opinion, is the overall idea of a cyber deterrence, is it succeeding or failing? We discussed this especially during your presentation, Jason, but of course, I would invite all of you to give your comments. The second question, from your perspective, as we have an interdisciplinary approach and background here on this panel, do you think that international law, with the status quo as introduced by Duncan, is it supporting the states in their quest for ensuring cyber deterrence? And last but not least, a question on NATO. So we've seen that some of the bigger allies, notably the US or France, in recent times they have come up with a more proactive approach. So speaking of countermeasures, offensive capabilities is no longer a taboo. So in your opinion, if some of the allies are pushing ahead, how's the situation with the others? Is NATO as an alliance, is it timely for NATO to consider moving on as alliance also to a more proactive posture, or is NATO better off with the status as it is right now? So in your opinions, please consider those different questions. And reminder to the audience that we will open your Q&A in a minute. But who wants to go first?
I'll defer to the...
Thank you.
Yay!
Quick remarks on all three questions, although on this panel I'm the one who is least competent on international law. Succeeding or failing, I mean, it's a difficult call. First of all, because this is uncharted territory. Deterrence in cyberspace is not comparable to deterrence in other fields, such as the nuclear domain, where the main indicator of success or failure of deterrence is whether something happened, and nothing has happened. So in this respect, deterrence in the nuclear domain has been a big success story. In this case, of course, it's much more difficult to measure the impact of deterrence. And there could be cases of successful deterrence that cannot be claimed, because this is an area in which many things happen below the radar screen and sort of gray area, and it is very difficult for individual states, for instance, to claim success in deterrence, because that would mean unveiling threats and hostile operations that could also have a negative effect on the wider public in that particular respect. And I would say that we also lack the possibility of doing counterfactuals. If we do something, we can see more or less what happens after that action, but we cannot do the same experiment with a different kind of action. Attribution is a key point. I mean, it is a highly contested issue politically and strategically. It is very difficult at this stage to say that attribution per se, public or not, is working. There is a mixed record so far in this particular respect, and I think it is a fast-evolving situation, and I think it is a case of trial and error, and to see exactly what works and what may not work, and it will take time to have a sufficient assessment of that. Whether international law works, yet again, it depends a little bit on what you are looking at. I think that most of the hostile malicious activities that we see, and we are very often the target of, are intelligence operations. And intelligence operations are not subject or addressed by international law. And therefore, of course, the boundary between what is an intelligence operation, intelligence gathering, basically, and a more hostile activity that could lead to sabotage, exploitation, and so on and so forth, is very often a very fuzzy boundary. And it is very difficult to establish in advance when the second part of the equation could lead to the application of international law. So I think that we are confronted with challenges that are factual challenges that are very difficult to answer to with a clear yes or no. On NATO, clearly this is a domain in which national doctrines are evolving very, very fast under the pressure of events and development. I would say that, I mean, I am in this job, I've been in this job for 1 year and a half, and already over this period of roughly 18 months, I have seen national doctrines of big and small nations evolve very, very fast. And it is extremely interesting to see around the table in committees at the Alliance the steps forward in many, many cases that are being made by different players that go sometimes even against the expectations that one would have of the conduct and the priorities of individual states. Certainly there is a realization that more has to be done. Certainly, cyber-related threats are in the radar screen of decision makers now, including at the top political national level. I think we have seen over the past couple of years also threats to the integrity of our democratic institutions and processes, and this is something that hits decision makers. They do realize that something has to be done to this effect. It is still, I think, very early to tell where this could lead, and I mean, I can testify myself that sometimes there are 3 steps ahead and 1 step behind taken at the multilateral level. But it's extremely interesting to see that now there is awareness of the issue. Until a few years ago, until even a few months ago, this was still restricted to a very limited and narrow team of experts in this field. Now there is widespread awareness that this matters. This is the new normal, and then we have to deal with it.
Thank you.
And I love that last point. That was going to be my what I was going to say on NATO, right? It was easier to imagine NATO. It was easy to see NATO as helpless when the leadership seemed mystified on cyber, when the members of the NAC were, I don't understand this, I can't program my VCR. It wasn't quite that bad, but it was. And now seeing the exercises, seeing more confidence in the NAC, seeing the statement, seeing the policy statements, the exercises. And I don't know if anyone's deterred by that, but it's certainly confidence inspiring for the defenders and those of us that are looking to NATO. And hopefully, if it's inspiring confidence in us, it's having an opposite impact on, on the other side. So I've really been thrilled at that. I've always been hoping that NATO might do an Article 4 consultation on election interference. And I still have my fingers crossed because I think that would be a very useful application of Article 4. On law supporting states, it's a great question. You know, it's a core, you know, I'm not an international relations theorist by academic training. And so it's been very interesting to sit in this great international relations school, because it's a classic question for my IR colleagues of what restrains states. If states aren't doing things, then what are the causal explanations for why they're choosing restraint? And that might be international law is one of those. It might be they're deterred. It might be self-interest. Joe and I like to talk about entanglement. If we do something to you, it's going to bounce back on us. And I think too often we've just been focused on one of those aspects. If you're military, you tend to look at deterrence. If you're in Tallinn, you tend to talk about international law. That's what we do here. But my ARA colleagues also talk about order, right? What made the Congress of Vienna so lasting? And it wasn't a time of peace. It was a time of relative peace. And it wasn't about law. It was largely about order of the nations of Europe saying, all right, we've been through something bad. Let's make sure that we're managing the situation. And so I do want us to think about what are these other ways? What does order look like? If you're in order, you might have to give things up in order to gain something larger. What does that look like? And on the And it's true on the, as the Secretary General had said, you can't prove deterrence is working. But with nuclear deterrence, we know it didn't fail. Right? We didn't have any mushroom clouds. And failure for cyber deterrence, I think, is also louder than success. You can't measure it succeeding, but you can measure if it's failing in large-scale attacks, for example. And what we did in the article was we said, it's going to be incredibly difficult to ever get to actual causation. That state aid did this or didn't do that, and the result was this. It's just going to be incredibly difficult. But you can at least do some simplest correlation. It struck me, I was listening to the radio one time, and the nuclear physicists were saying, we're doing these colliders, these particle colliders, and we're starting to get so much energy into these collisions that some of the theories are looking less and less likely. The explanatory power of these theories is starting to disappear because we would have seen evidence for them by now. So, all right, let's say if the argument of General Nakasone or John Bolton that this is going to make things better, let's just imagine if in future we look at large-scale disruptive attacks as a category of a policymaker's category, a policy wants to see a reduction, and we do see a reduction. Well, that's what the Hawk said was going to happen. It doesn't prove it, but at least it is in compliance with the theory. If we say a dramatic increase after the policy is enacted and we take actions to pursue persistent engagement, it is not compliant with the theory. It's not saying it's wrong. It's just saying that those people that said it was going to make things way better if we started to impose costs directly on the network through forward defense, they've got a lot more explaining to do. Because a simple read of the evidence is saying it's not working out that way. It's not saying they're wrong. It's not getting to causation. It's barely correlation. It's saying they've got more explaining to do than the folks that are saying it's gonna make things worse, because it is in compliance with that argument.
Okay.
So, I'd add on those three questions. I think with respect to international law, you may have noticed I said the question is, what is it that we want to deter, and then used broad international law categories and didn't actually associate some of the activity in cyberspace we want to deter. And I think, I did that on purpose, because I think, ultimately that's been the challenge, is getting states to articulate at a level of precision what they think they are defending against and what they are going to punish for behavior. And I think there's clarity at the top end. And so, again, the no digital Pearl Harbor, I think, is of value. And it may not demonstrate the success of deterrence, but the absence of failure is useful. Although, certain events in Ukraine do beg the question of precisely how successful it is. I think one of the things we found, and this was, of course, the challenge with Tallinn Manual 2.0, is that once we moved below the use of force threshold, international lawyers, we've actually spent a lot less time on general customary rules in this space, because most international lawyers specialize in the environment or human rights or trade and the like. And so what we found was there's a lot of the difficulty in measuring the success or failure ends up being the difficulty of we're not sure what box to put things in to then ask the question of whether it's being deterred or not. And so, one of the challenges has been, we're trying to deter election interference, and where does that fit in this framework? Is that a violation of a political norm, or does that fit as an internationally wrongful act? And if so, which one? Intellectual property theft by espionage, is that more like espionage that, as we've heard, is traditionally, if not outside of international law looks the other way? Or is it somehow something, about trade and intellectual property services and subject to it? So I think that's been kind of the challenge in measuring success or failure. And again, I'll harken back. Most international lawyers, you say to them, well, what do you think about deterrence in international law? And apologies to those of you who have thought about this, but most of us haven't. Most of us will tell you what we think the international law is, where we think there's ambiguities, or give you an it depends answer, and we haven't tried to associate it with the goals, because for most international lawyers, the goal is to advance law, not advance some deterrence strategy. In terms of the overall cyber deterrence succeeding or failing, one thing I'd add to this is to harken back to the who question. I mean, we also shouldn't unify who we're trying to deter. Obviously, I think deterrence is much harder with rogue actors, and there are several of whom, there's a real open question of what could you possibly do that will deter below the use of force threshold, right? I think, I do think it breaks out that way. But let's not also forget that these deterrent activities have a constructive value in that they also plant a flag and rally, whether it's NATO or whether it's a broader community of like-minded states, around certain norms. Because again, the things we're trying to get states not to do, or the things we want states to do defensively, even if you're not piercing the 4, 5, 6 rogue actors, you are solidifying a community, and that may actually both improve defenses overall, and if you can act collectively, provide a better basis for imposing costs. And so I do think that that's one of the questions I have on the going forward, is whether or not we need to think more about, can we get international law to a collective countermeasures stage, or what are the risks of collective countermeasures that might say we're not ready for it yet? I think with NATO, I liked the behind versus, caught up if not ahead. I tend to agree that, think about how far NATO's come in 12 years on this. And I think the question I'd ask is what NATO could be doing beyond policy in terms of actual operations. And so, to me, tying this with the collective question is, what value or what risks would there be to escalation of NATO making a collective accusation of a cyber operation coming from NATO as opposed to an ad hoc collection of states? I mean, we've begun to see states saying there's more value if instead of one of us saying, we know X, you did this and it was wrong, suddenly states saying, we all know this, because you get less blowback on what's your technical indicators or compromise if you can actually get multiple states. And I don't know that NATO should do it. I mean, there's definitely, because that puts it in a military lens, it might risk escalation, or putting a state in a mindset where they'd move to escalation rather than retreat. But it's a question I think worth asking.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's okay.
All right. Great. Thank you to the panel. And now, ladies and gentlemen, let's move to the Q&A phase. Please state your name and IP address in case we need to follow back on you. And one of our good volunteers, or several of them in the hall, they will hand you the mic. So please raise your arm, represent yourself, and ask a question. Yeah, gentlemen. Yeah, there. I'll stand up so I can see you.
Thank you. My name is Nicholas Ott. I work for the OEC, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I have a question for you, Jay. Your comments on deterrence and persistent engagement got me thinking, what else is out there? What kind of concepts beside persistent engagement are worth looking into? So if I handed you a card saying cyber deterrence and blank, what would be the concept that should be maybe compared to persistent engagement as a way to make cyber deterrence more effective?
Well, again, I wouldn't necessarily say to make cyber deterrence more effective, because to me, that's just absolutely loaded, right? I mean, in international relations theory, in international relations, deterrence is a theory. It's a causal theory that says to get peace, you need capability, and the other side has to understand your willingness to use it. It's a theory that if you do that, it's going to lead to peace. There's a competing theory of security dilemma that says if you get capabilities and have the willingness to use it, everyone else is going to see you have that. They're not going to understand what your intentions are, and so therefore they have to have capability and the willingness to use it, and therefore you end up in an escalation. We don't yet know which of those theories is applicable here. I see way more on the security dilemma side. One of my colleagues at Columbia said, a guy named Bob Jervis, said in 1978, a security dilemma is doubly dangerous if it's offense dominant and you can't distinguish offense from defense. Because then if you can't distinguish offense from defense, then if I gain weapons, you don't know if I intend them to attack you or defend myself. If it's offense dominant, then it gives a lot of advantage to attacking first. Kind of sounds like our field, right? Those are the things that we say about cyber conflict. So I think there's a lot of dynamics of the security dilemma here. We can't just distinguish offense from defense. We can't distinguish offense, defense, espionage, operational preparation in the environment, and the rest. So I prefer not even to use the word deterrence most of the time. I want stability, right? We haven't crossed that line, particularly into death and destruction yet. I want to throw as much concrete and rebar into that line to make sure that we're not going across it. So I'm much more concerned about stability than I am about deterrence. I I really, if I can pull it all the way out, I want sustainability. And to me, that is the root of any time I'm looking at a cyber policy question, including espionage. And if espionage is okay or how much espionage is enough. When our kids and grandkids are our age, are they going to have an internet that's at least as free, secure, open, resilient, and as awesome as the one that we have today? That, to me, is the question. And if deterrence is going to help us get there, great. But to me, that's what we need. That's what we ought to be aiming for out of this. Because if we're not getting that, then what the hell are we doing? And if everybody's peeing in the pool, and some countries are bragging about how big their bladder is, right? And because they're thinking that's going to lead to a better situation, right? So I really want us to get out of the military mindset in this and start looking at sustainability in most cases.
Okay.
Thanks, Nicholas.
Next question. Lady in the third row, sorry.
Gentlemen, Cadet Asia Murray from United States Military Academy. My question is, do you regard tacit bargaining as fostering an environment that increases potential threats over time due to unclear or fuzzy borders of what is acceptable and unacceptable in cyberspace? Thank you.
Guess that's due to me. Thanks, Cadet. The argument of tacit bargaining has a lot of, it's a great concept. And they took it right out of Schelling, one of the classic international relations theorists. But in the nuclear age, you had, or in regular warfare, you've got a lot of ways that you can communicate to the other side about what is acceptable or what is not acceptable, right? We can send B-52s flying between the Taiwan Strait. We can fly B-52s over South Korea. Sorry, I'm going to keep using Air Force examples. Insert some Army example if you want. Right, we can send some Navy ships off. We've got all sorts of ways to signal in regular conflict that things are getting too far, right? Move the tanks to the border. There you go. Move the tanks to the border. And we don't have most of those in cyber conflict for our bargaining. Almost all of the bargaining is going to happen between the military and espionage forces themselves in close contact with the enemy. We don't particularly have hotlines. We don't have any good way where it's classified on each side, and we're not even confessing that we're doing this activity. So all of the theory of communication that tacit bargaining would normally rely on, so that you can tap out for the other side, to say, okay, enough is enough, I'll back off. We don't have. Tacit bargaining works best if you're really only fighting on the stuff that doesn't comply with the norms. But there's no way Cyber Command is going to allow adversary espionage to happen that's within norms, and we're not going to contest that. And so I think, because everything that we do is going to be perceived as a signal. And so if the Iranians are absolutely following the norms that are prescribed, and so Cyber Command somehow says they're vulnerable, but we're not gonna kick them, right? Which is not the military thing, right? They're down, you finish off your adversary. Let's just say Cyber Command doesn't do that. Justice is still going to indict them because what they're doing is a crime. And that's going to be perceived by the Iranians as a strong signal from the United States. So it's got a lot of problems with it, assuming that tacit bargaining is going to work.
So I would just jump in only on the last part. So I think there's an interesting question of what the tacit bargaining is with respect to the indictments, right? Because it's clearly part of a strategy, and there is prosecutorial discretion. So in theory, you could decide not to prosecute, but that is not the mindset in the U.S. government right now. But you could have a model where you say, and I think part of the indictment strategy from 2015 on was, in some ways, well, we're not ready yet to come out and actually claim State X did it, but we'll take 5 of their officers and put them out there, or we'll dox this North Korean agent, and that will be how we communicate back to the Capitol. We think you've crossed some lines, and you better rein it in. But it risks some of our guys getting indictments and having not to travel and the like. The problem is, as you say, is what's the benefit or the positive reinforcement you can give? And there's always just because justice hasn't prosecuted you today, you got a long statute of limitations on this stuff, and so that's the trouble. I think is it could be you could restrain from prosecuting, but a new prosecutor can come in on a moment's notice and go all legal on you.
Well, if you take this question from a slightly different angle, I think it could be interesting to explore what could be done in terms of limiting, not the weapons, because that is not a domain in which you can really control the weapons. The weapons are portable, they can be recreated, they can be hidden. It is impossible to do that. Traditional arms control approaches to this are very, very difficult to apply. But what you can try and define is limiting the targets. That is the holy grail of this discussion, and reaching a degree of international consensus on limiting the targets in light of international law, including international humanitarian law, and so on and so forth. And I think we are still, as I said, in uncharted territory, because it is extremely difficult to detect certain operations. It is sometimes difficult to unveil and call out certain operations. It is sometimes technically difficult. The forensics could be complicated, could take time. You may not want to show your hand. What are your sources in order to be able to attribute? And even attribution per se, well, is it going to deter bad behavior, or is it going to escalate bad behavior? And I think these are all issues on which it is still very difficult to make a final assessment. What is certain is that we are all at a point at which doing nothing is no longer acceptable, is no longer possible. When bad behavior, when malicious cyber activities occur, there is an urge to make that clear that these are unacceptable forms of behavior. There is another issue that goes beyond the bilateral bargaining, and it is precisely because of the nature of cyber activities, there is a world global audience here. And when there is a controversy between two parties, a stricken party that is calling out the other party, there is an audience of, in the UN, more than 100 countries, and there is also the wider publics at home in our own countries that are there and listen to what is being said. And I think this is also an argument, a case that has to be won. And it is important to be able also to change the mindset of certain so-called swing states. They are called like this, for instance, in the UN General Assembly, whose opinion is going to probably tip the balance between what I would call the political West, like-minded countries, and those actors, the big actors that instead are against the full application of international law in cyberspace and tend to be behind bad behavior at the international level. So there is also an international audience that you have to keep in mind, and that is why this debate on limiting the targets is probably something we should pursue further.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, gentleman in the middle.
Thank you very much. This is Barış Egemen Özkan. I'm from the SHAPE SIOC, Cyberspace Operations Center. Speaking of the deterrence, resilience is the buzzword and seems to be the leading way to achieve the deterrence by denial by many academias. And when we're talking about the resilience, depending on whom we are talking, sometimes we're talking about the resilience at the physical infrastructures, and depending on whom we are talking, sometimes we talk about the virtual networks and the resilience of the virtual layer. And if not much, but sometimes we talk about the personal layer and the resilience of the individuals. But when we look at the election meddling in 2016, and the reports, when we read them, no matter who won the elections, it seems like we would end up reading the same reports, but only the names would be different. So the real target is not the candidate who lost the election, but the real target seems to be the election system itself, and the fairness and the trust of the society in the election systems. And when we look at the election systems, is the primary pillar of the democracy. And democracy is one of the common values of the shared values of the Western cultures. So all this laid out, the real target seems to be the shared values of the society that's keeping all together, basically. So when we lose these these bonding elements, there's not much left for the adversary to carry on further actions, but just sitting back and watching us hurting each other, because we all know that we're well capable of hurting each other when there is no other reason not to hurt each other. So speaking of that,
a question?
What do you think about the resilience of the shared values, which seems to be undermined in the discussions in the deterrence, and what the nations and the organizations like the NATO and the EU should do, must do, to reinforce those shared values to keep us united and together?
We have 1 minute.
1 minute. 1 minute each.
Well, I read recently a book published in the United States titled Like War, and it's about the misuse of social media in order to undermine our societies. And I think that this is probably what we are talking about. Election interference didn't occur only in the United States in 2016. There is evidence that that occurred during the referendum in the UK on the EU, that it happened during the French presidential elections in 2017 and during the Catalan referendum on independence in 2017. So it is not limited to the United States. It shows a vulnerability that we have, which is perhaps an intrinsic vulnerability of democratic societies, that we are in favor of free speech, and we are only belatedly recognizing that this is also being exploited against us, that there is a clear attack on social cohesion, there is a clear attack on, you said, the shared values, the fundamental rules of our societies. I think this is something for the long haul. It starts with education, it starts with better protecting networks, it starts with better cooperation with the private sector. These social platforms are owned by the private sector, and unless we manage to involve them more proactively in helping us out in this, it will be very, very difficult to build up sufficient defenses to this effect. And of course, there are also limits to what international law can do in this particular domain, also because we don't want to mirror the behavior of the other side. We don't want to restrict our liberties in order to defend our systems, and so on and so forth. So this is just to highlight the complexity of this that goes beyond the restricted, limited cyber deterrence issue.
Great. On cyber resilience, we've got to get defense better than offense, right? We've got to switch things around so that the defender has the advantage over the attackers. I think it's possible. On the values, and thank you very much for talking about unity and values. I think it's a nice way to finish off. And it gives us another reason to thank Estonia and Tallinn and the CCDCOE. This is my 10th year. I started coming in 2009. And it's a great opportunity for me to talk to my European colleagues. And I think the places like the Center and NATO have been fantastic at building that trust. So my thanks.
Yeah, I would close also echoing the thanks. And I think this is where, whether it's international law or cyber norms, I mean, part of the thing is remember that we're trying to build shared expectations within a given community. And so the challenge is how do we negotiate what and sometimes that community is all nation states or the globe, but you also have the opportunity, and that should be the focus in terms of, even if we can't get that, what are the other communities in which we want to settle? What do we stand for? So just like, those of you in the military, there's certain professional codes. You have norms as parents. You have norms as a member of a religious group. Part of the challenge for us with cyber is, figuring out what are the norms of democracies that we're going to accept and we're going to fight for to reinforce those social values. And so, it's not necessarily a legal question. It's a sociological one of how do we sustain and maintain that, because otherwise, you're right. I think we can see things fray quickly and unfortunately.
Great. Thank you very much to the panel. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but this was just the first of about 5 strategy sessions and discussions we shall have at CyCon. So please come back in 29 minutes. But before you walk out, please join me in thanking the panel with a big round of applause.